appalling events in the United States. Events which have shaken to the core the basic assumptions of American life and which were described by President George W. Bush today as acts of war against freedom and democracy. We're on the air until 10:30 with extended reports from New York and Washington. As you probably know by now, because of what happened in America, tonight's Champions League fixtures have been postponed. The effects of that disaster clearly being felt across Europe and around the world. In the next few minutes, we'll bring you all the latest news on the attack on America, the human cost of the tragedy, the world's reaction to what happened, the aftermath of the attacks. And then, in an hour, the ITV News at 10, with a full roundup of all the major developments of the day. First, though, the latest from America. And it's been another day of innumerable unfolding stories of the tragic events in New York and in Washington. These are the main developments. FBI officers trying to find those in America implicated in the attacks have raided homes and hotels and made a number of arrests. And there's another development. It's emerged within the last hour that the security services had what they called credible information that the terrorists intended to hit either the White House or Air Force One, the presidential plane. And that may have been the reason why President Bush did not immediately return to Washington from Florida. And tonight, one estimate here said there could be hundreds of Britons among the thousands of dead. Here's our foreign news correspondent, Paul Davis.
Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents surrounded a hotel in Boston this afternoon. Camera crews and members of the public were kept outside as officers entered the building behind shields. They believe the terrorists who hijacked 2 passenger planes from Boston's Logan Airport yesterday before flying them to New York and crashing them into the World Trade Center may have used the hotel as a base. It's not yet known if they found anyone or anything to confirm those suspicions. Today, a new dawn broke over Manhattan, but it brought with it no relief from America's nightmare. Not when these shattered stumps are all that now remains of the World Trade Center. Not when so many of the 50,000 people who used to work there didn't return home last night. They and the many more who came to help them in their desperate need remain buried somewhere beneath the twisted metal and rubble. In the hours since yesterday's catastrophic assault on the heart of America, more chilling film footage has emerged, helping to explain what happened, if not how or why. It's now believed that terrified passengers had been herded to the back of the hijacked planes by terrorists armed with knives. Filmed from every angle, these images have been watched and have caused horror around the world. Another cameraman who'd been filming near the famous Twin Towers turned instinctively towards the sound of the diving plane and captured the moment thousands of people perished. It was the inferno caused by thousands of tons of burning aviation fuel that melted steel, weakened the structure, and caused the towers to collapse, killing thousands who'd survived the initial impact. Experts today said no building could have survived such an attack.
Right here. Stay right here. Let's go. Here it comes.
Hundreds of firemen and emergency workers were buried by the collapsing towers, adding to the death toll. New York's Mayor Giuliani visited their surviving colleagues, thanking them for working on in such desperate conditions.
It's terrible. I mean, the damage is terrible. People are doing everything that they can to rescue as many people as possible, and this is going to be a long-term effort. So I just wanted to make sure that everything is here that could be here, and it is. So we just pray to God that we can save a few people.
But saving lives in streets where the rubble is now piled higher than most tall buildings elsewhere will not be easy. For all the thousands of people who are missing, very few bodies have been recovered. And it is against this backdrop of cataclysmic damage that the British government has warned that hundreds of British citizens may be among those lost. As the first of the dead were being recovered, their bodies placed in temporary morgues, America awaited the response of its president and the military whose intelligence services had failed to stop the fanatics. President George Bush, who will be judged by history on his handling of this crisis, was finally able to return to the White House. He told the nation that terrorists must not be allowed to win.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
The first response of many Americans living in and around New York and Washington has been to offer blood to help the hospitals and medical teams dealing with casualties on an unprecedented scale. If America feels she is now at war, that impression can only be supported by these images. US military and their guns patrolling the streets of Lower Manhattan, protecting against an unseen enemy while the enormous rescue operation continues. The emergency teams are exhausted but determined to continue. Many have friends and colleagues on the missing list. New York City officials say it could be weeks before it's known just how many thousands of people died here. Paul Davis, ITN.
Let's go now to our correspondent James Mates in New York. James, an extraordinarily eerie day in New York, and particularly so in Lower Manhattan. What's the latest from there tonight?
Well, the search and the rescue operation goes on. There were reports overnight of 9 people being pulled out of there alive, but since this morning there do not appear to have been any more survivors, not that we've been told about anyway. We were able this morning to get within about 3 city blocks of there, from where you could smell the smoke and taste the dust in the air. You couldn't actually get up to the rubble itself, but talking to rescue workers and paramedics coming out, they spoke of a scene of utter devastation, of body parts, of bodies littered all over the place, buried in soot. They talked of the attempts to move those dead people into a makeshift mortuary in what was once a Brooks Brothers store. The rubble is being loaded up into trucks and shipped across the Hudson River to Staten Island, which is where the FBI are going to go through it, looking for evidence and, of course, for any bodies that may be scooped up that way. They're going to do it that way rather than because of the sheer scale of the rubble there. To try and do it on site would just take too long. So a very, very grim situation down there in southern Manhattan, and it's not going to be cleared up quickly. James Mates in New York for the time being. Thank you. Joining me now is Jeff McAllister, the London Bureau Chief of America's Time magazine. Jeff McAllister, there must be some relief tonight that some people have been held, technically, they're not under arrest, but they've been held tonight in Boston in connection with this incident.
Absolutely. The notion that it might be possible to find out who perpetrated this and roll back these networks to their source, especially given the scale of the intelligence failure that's represented by the range of attacks, is obviously good news. I talked to one American official who said, in fact, that the bad guys had been very sloppy. It was like a stabbing in a hotel hotel lobby. There were bloody footprints everywhere. And if it's true that this is the case, then I think there will be quick action, perhaps militarily, as the United States develops confidence that its assessment of who's behind this, probably Osama bin Laden, is in fact correct.
Well, you talk about developing confidence, and I want to ask you this. We've heard today from the President, from Secretary of State Colin Powell. Are you in any doubt that the Americans have the resolve to pursue those who might have been responsible for this attack?
Absolutely not. There's no downside in some respects politically for the President to take strict action. And what would anyone expect? What allies will disagree? NATO is invoking Article 5 to make this an act of war against all the members. There may be UN resolutions backing it too. And so why should Americans, faced with this devastation, lack resolve under these circumstances?
You've been sitting here in London working for Time magazine, watching this plethora of images, disturbing, devastating images coming in. What have you learned so far, looking at the pictures and trying to contextualize it, about the mood in America?
Well, probably we're all in the same boat in that respect. The devastation, the horror, the fear that people sometimes feel, but also combined with acts of heroism and pride and a resolve to go forward. It's a very complicated, I think, set of emotions, but I think there's a lot of recognition that it's a whole new world out there for America, and that's perhaps a source of long-term unease, while also confidence that the institutions are going to continue and that the government is in fact working quite well.
We've been saying it, and it's probably, sadly, lapsed into a kind of cliche, really, but do you think it's challenged the sort of basic assumptions of American life? After all, America the Great, America the Free, these attacks tend to contradict that basic perception.
Perhaps not contradicting the great and the free. I think it does contradict the Fortress America notion that has been very easy for Americans to have really for centuries, and certainly since Pearl Harbor, the last major attack on American soil. This is the disturbing thing, that this kind of attack can happen in America, and not from nuclear weapons or from large ships, or the kinds of things that are easy to contend with, in a sense, when you have the world's largest military, but hijacked airplanes, small numbers of terrorists who can take the ordinary objects of civilian life and render them into huge weapons. This is indeed disturbing, but it is not, I think, just disturbing for Americans, but for British people and French people, and indeed for people around the world who have to contend with really a whole new reality.
Might it have shifted the emphasis from things like missile defense?
I don't see any recognition of that so far. The Republicans on the right wing are saying the same things. In fact, they're saying this proves the need for missile defense because it shows that all sorts of threats are out there. This will be, however, an interesting debate in the days ahead.
Jeff McAllister, thank you. Throughout the day, more details have been emerging about the human cost of this tragedy. Estimates on the true number of those who lost their lives are still that. Just estimates. No one can be sure. Families across the length and breadth of the United States have been waiting for news and fearing the worst. In many cases, those worst fears have been realized. Yet in the middle of such a shattering loss of life, there have been remarkable stories of survival and of bravery. Here's Colin Baker.
America is struggling to count its victims, innocent victims of a war they knew nothing of, a war undeclared until the first life was taken yesterday morning. And now America and the international community strives also to come to terms with the morality of those fanatics and zealots who planned and succeeded in taking so many lives. The morning the world changed, witnessed and photographed by a New York medic, Dr. Mark Heath, who rushed to the World Trade Center, arriving at the very moment the second tower collapsed.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Yeah. Can I get a toot? I'm seeing a couple of clean breaths.
A toot, as Dr. Heath calls it, is life-giving oxygen from the fireman's breathing apparatus.
Okay. Back to you.
In the fallout, shadows move slowly, dazed and traumatized.
A dusty twilight has obliterated the sunshine, and Dr. Heath, stepping on who knows what, feels his way forward in this threatening and suffocating air.
This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Oh, wait, maybe it was this one.
Files, papers, documents which were in cabinets or on desks litter the streets now of those who worked with them, studied them, tore them up, or even filed them. There is for the moment no sign. Not in Dr. Heath's world.
There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you? Oxygen.
Don't have oxygen.
Fire and rescue teams are clearly in shock, desperate for clean air, but lucky to be breathing even this foul atmosphere. Many of their colleagues were further forward. They will not have survived.
That guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks.
The whistles are from the alarm beacons on the fire officers' suits, a plague of them echoing, but many more crushed into silence. Mark Heath struggles on, a professional skilled in saving life, and like many others on this morning, driven by concern for others, and all of them distinguished by lack of thought for themselves.
They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, and that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. It's not a thing that you think about, you just move, try to get out of the way. That's it. Be thankful that I wasn't in closer. The bravery of the people who went in there is something else.
Some of the hijacked passengers managed to make cell phone calls to their partners and family before impact. Mark Bingham called his sister and mother before his plane crashed in Pennsylvania.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said
that the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him.
Television network presenter Barbara Olson called her husband before crashing and also tried to call the FBI. Ruth McCourt and her daughter Giuliani died in the second plane to crash into the World Trade Center. Her brother Ronnie, by coincidence, was working there and escaped and later talked to his brother John.
He said that he had a feeling his sister, my sister, had left Logan Airport to go to Los Angeles with her daughter around 7:30 in the morning. So we were then concerned that my sister could have been on either of the 2 flights that crashed into the towers, and has been confirmed. She was on that flight with her daughter.
British lawyer Mark Oliver was working on the 57th floor of the North Tower when it was struck.
I then turned to look out of the window, and I don't know what made me turn to look outside of the window. But I was standing right by the window, and just on the other side of the window was what I now appreciate was what was the remains of the plane, and that was a truly horrific sight of what was falling literally within 3 feet of my face. You know, or what was obviously burning fuel that was alight. There were chairs. I saw a shoe go past. We'd gone down about 5 stories from the 44th floor when we were suddenly lots of screaming from above us to move to the right and to move into single file. and the burns and the walking wounded walked past us, and people obviously rushing to get them down. They were the priority to get them down.
The stories of the lucky and narrow escapes are welcome at a time when disbelief is still so prevalent and the potential loss of life so enormous. In the days to come, good news from New York will increasingly be more difficult to find. Colin Baker, ITN.
Throughout this evening, information has been coming into the ITV newsroom. Helen Wright is there. Helen, what other information do we have tonight about what happened on board those hijacked planes?
Trevor, utterly chilling details of other things that happened on board those hijacked planes. For example, air crew being seized and stabbed within minutes of one plane taking off. Another passenger on one of the planes calling his wife, saying, "I know we're going to die. Some of us are going to try and do something about it." And reports that air traffic controllers heard the hijackers on one of the planes telling the crew, "We have other planes, we have other planes." And here in London tonight, a warning from Downing Street that it is likely that British casualties in New York will run into hundreds.
So some terrible events, but there have also been, as we said, stories of quite remarkable heroism.
Absolutely. Reports of emergency crews being taken to hospital with injuries they've sustained, clawing through debris and rubble with their bare hands. I've heard reports of one firefighter continuing to work while his brother, another firefighter, was among the 250 or so emergency workers still missing, presumed dead. And heroic tales from ordinary New Yorkers who have mounted around-the-clock service to keep emergency crews fed, to provide drinks for them, others who've donated clothing for those who've lost absolutely everything, other volunteers who've set up shelters for those who can't go back to their homes.
And I think you have some information, Helen, about how tomorrow the world, in a rare show of unanimity, will mark the events of yesterday.
Yeah, in London tomorrow, the Queen has ordered a special changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace as a sign of respect and in mourning for those who lost their lives in New York. Friday has also been declared a day of mourning across Europe, and in London on Friday there will be a special service at St Paul's Cathedral which the Queen is due to attend. That'll be for the friends and relatives of victims of these tragedies in America.
Helen Wright, thank you. The world remembering what happened in America yesterday. In what could be an ominous sign, hospitals in New York have been admitting that the number of people they admitted were less than they expected. That points to only one thing, sadly, the possibility of a large number of bodies in the mounds of rubble. Staffing levels had been tripled, but the Mayor of New York said today that so far only 1,700 people are known to have been treated. Here's our medical correspondent, Sue Saddle.
The frustration for hospitals dealing with the aftermath of this devastation is that so few casualties were brought in today. Fewer than 2,000 people are thought to have been treated in New York's hospitals so far, yet thousands more are believed missing. The indications are ominous. While the hospitals wait for the injured to arrive, rescue workers search desperately in the rubble for anyone who might still be alive. Some of those trapped in the debris have made calls for help from their mobile phones. Ambulances ferried the injured to hospitals where relatives and friends have been waiting anxiously for news. But it will be some time yet before firms can account for all their office workers who might have been in the buildings. Emergency workers themselves are known to be among the casualties.
We did lose an ambulance. One of our ambulances was crushed in the debris. But our hearts certainly go out to our colleagues in the fire department and in the police department and all of the other victims.
Urgent appeals went out for people to give blood to help the expected thousands of casualties.
It's a big catastrophe, and I'm Israeli, and I hope that now people understand what we have to deal with, the kind of people that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It's just a catastrophe.
Hundreds of people queued up at the American Red Cross to give blood. Many had no idea of their blood group as they'd never given blood before. Donation centres created makeshift wards to cope with the numbers wanting to help. Some knew they had a more rare blood group and that supplies would be quickly depleted. Day and night, the rescue teams have been working non-stop. The fact that emergency workers themselves will be among the dead will add to the psychological impact of such a colossal tragedy, says one British expert.
The effect of so many emergency workers being killed in this will be quite devastating to the emergency services in general. I think as the general public we often take the emergency services for granted and sometimes see them as a bit of an irritant where they close off streets and so on. We often forget that they put themselves in harm's way very frequently and experience a very real risk of death. In this particular instance, I think that the surviving emergency workers who are directly involved may well be at risk of enduring psychiatric difficulties in the future.
Workers and rescuers at the Pentagon building in Washington will be going through similar experiences. Dedicated 24-hour mental health phone lines have been set up to help those affected begin to cope with what's happened. Sue Saville, ITN.
With me now in the studio is Dr. Annie McGuinness. She's an accident and emergency doctor at University College Hospital in London. Dr. McGuinness, we know a great deal, sadly in modern life now, about dealing with trauma. But surely the events of yesterday are on a vastly different scale to most things we've seen before.
Well, they're certainly very different from anything we've had to deal with in the UK or Europe or America. Mass casualties like this usually happen in more remote parts of the world which don't have the medical facilities available in the US.
So does that make it any easier in America, or how difficult is it nevertheless to treat?
I think that this is an immense disaster and the people dealing with it will be very affected by it. For a start, the scale of the disaster in downtown Manhattan will have shocked the people to the core who work there, and I believe there are large numbers of probably very badly injured people coming through. What helps people to cope is practice and teamwork, and the Americans are, experts in trauma training and in trauma teamwork, and I'm sure they will have well-rehearsed teams for dealing with the average types of civilian casualties and shootings and road disasters. What they will not be familiar with is probably the extent and the nature of the physical trauma to the victims of accidents like this, which is different and quite distressing sometimes for the medical and nursing personnel who have to deal with it. So they might find that more distressing for different reasons than road accidents and shootings and stabbings.
Because this is an enormous dilemma here, isn't it? Somebody comes in with physical injuries. There is, of course, a huge range of psychological problems, perhaps, also to be dealt with.
With the victims themselves or with the staff?
With people who've survived. Victims, though, injured.
Well, the immediate victims who have to go to theatre and have operations and so on usually deal with that surgery and post-surgery phase quite well. In the long term, the victims and the viewers and the relatives of the victims can have psychological problems.
What about you referred to this earlier, what about the basic business of people who were there and who managed to survive unscathed? We look back at them and think, great good fortune. But of course they still have problems in returning to this arena, to this territory.
Sometimes people who have been passive onlookers or not had a role to do in extricating and helping people have psychological difficulties, and sometimes they feel guilty that they're the one that escaped when all the random were killed or maimed or injured. And people, there are mechanisms, there are ways of dealing with this. They have psychological counsellors and so on.
Dr. McGuinness, thank you very much. Let's turn now to reaction around the world, beginning with developments here in Britain. Tonight, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner said there could be hundreds of British dead. Parliament is to be recalled. The Prime Minister promised again to help America in the fight against terrorism. Here's our political editor, John Sargent.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner left Downing Street tonight with Jack Straw. He told the Foreign Secretary and other ministers at the meeting that the number of British people killed in the attack was likely to run into hundreds. The official signs of mourning were in evidence, with flags at Westminster and in Downing Street at half-mast. The Prime Minister emphasised that this was Britain's tragedy as well as America's.
Given the likely death toll, there will be many citizens of other states who will have died. I have to say to you that I fear significant numbers of them will be British. So in a very real and direct sense, the interests of this country are engaged.
A flood of calls to the Scotland Yard helpline later produced the forecast of a British death toll running into hundreds. Mr. Blair also stressed that in a broader sense, America was by no means the only target, a point he had agreed with other world leaders.
We all agreed that this attack is an attack not only on America, but on the free and democratic world. It demands our complete and united condemnation, our determination to bring those responsible to justice, and our full support for the American people at this time of trial.
Mr. Blair announced that MPs would come back for a special debate on Friday.
I believe Parliament should be recalled, both because of the sheer magnitude of what has happened and its implications, but also because this was an attack not just on a number of buildings in the United States of America, but on the very notion of democracy.
Mr. Blair wouldn't comment directly on claims that Muslim extremists were responsible for the attack, but showing a clear concern for race relations in this country, he welcomed some of the comments from Muslim spokesmen.
As Muslim leaders and clerics around the world are making clear, such acts of infamy and cruelty are wholly contrary to the Islamic faith. The vast majority of Muslims are decent, upright people who share our horror at what has happened.
Questioned afterwards, the Prime Minister would not reveal how far Britain would be prepared to go in supporting American retaliation.
They will take the action that they consider appropriate. As I said earlier, what support we may give to that is something that we will consider at the appropriate time. But be under no doubt at all, we stand with the United States of America in this matter.
The Foreign Secretary made a brief trip to Brussels, where he met other European Union ministers in a determined attempt to reach a common position.
This attack happened on the soil of the United States, but it was an attack on all of us, attack on freedom and democracy and civilization and on humanity.
The NATO Secretary-General Lord Robertson was also there, stressing the need for a united alliance against the terrorists.
This is an act of solidarity of the European Union and NATO standing together at a day of profound tragedy, where the threat and the attack was not on the United States of America, but on the civilized world as a whole. So it's a very visible indication and symbol of where we stand, and we stand firm, we stand committed. Thank you very much.
But the test of unity will come when it's known how the United States intend to react. John Sargent, ITN, Westminster.
And now we can go live to Downing Street to join our political editor, John Sargent. John, the Prime Minister and the President spoke for about 20 minutes today. Presumably that wasn't just giving words of support to the Americans, it was much, much more.
It was much more, Trevor, there's no doubt about that. I think this has been a very carefully coordinated response involving the Prime Minister and the President and America's allies across the world. What Mr. Blair was trying to do is what every British Prime Minister is trying to do on these occasions, which is to make clear that when America is in difficulty, Britain is her best ally. So this conversation of 20 minutes, I'm sure it was extremely important, and Mr. Blair would take it as a sign of how well he can get on with Mr. Bush compared with the brilliant way they got on with Bill Clinton. What we do know is that when Mr. Bush spoke later of the need for patience and taking time in considering what action America would take in retaliation, those words, patience and taking time, were expected by British officials. They do not expect an instant American response, and I'm sure that was one of the key subjects discussed by the two men in their call earlier.
Now, John, Mr. Blair said it again today that an attack on America in this fashion was an attack on all democratic countries. Is there the sense that he is trying, or he is in the vanguard of trying to form this consensus to decide internationally what action should be taken?
I think this is extremely important. We talked about this yesterday, Trevor, this question of how far the Prime Minister went in his initial reaction, and he went much further than other world leaders. He didn't just simply show concern and sympathy for America, he immediately aligned Britain alongside America by saying it's an attack on all the free democracies of the world. Now that line that Mr. Blair took, he took as it were on his own. It was a British government initial line, but it's interesting the way that other world leaders have moved away from general condolences to talking exactly that same language. And I think we did see, although this is not confirmed by Downing Street officials, we did see the Prime Minister going perhaps 2 steps ahead of other world leaders, because he instantly realised how important it was to make sure there was a unified position, and it was a political decision, not just a matter of sympathy.
John Sargent in Downing Street, thank you. In the Middle East, Israel's president and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat both gave blood to be sent to the United States. There was also condemnation for those who had celebrated the attack. Meanwhile, dozens of men, women and children held a vigil outside the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. Our Middle East correspondent John Irvine reports.
It's been a national day of mourning in Israel, a day for people here to reach out and share the grief of this country's closest ally. The sympathy felt across Israel was on display outside the US Embassy on the Tel Aviv seafront. This is just a short distance from the scene of a suicide bombing in June that claimed 22 Israeli lives. People here understand America's pain.
I can relate to the suffering, and if I can do something to help, then I'll do everything.
Many Israelis have been giving blood to be sent on to America. So too have some Palestinians, most notably Yasser Arafat. Outside the American consulate in Arab East Jerusalem, Palestinians have demonstrated their sorrow. These scenes contrast sharply, but are more representative than yesterday's images of celebration. Hundreds of Palestinians have died in the fighting here, so these people believe they can also empathize with distraught Americans.
It's very saddening for everybody for the lives that were lost, and this is no way to gain anything for whoever was trying to send their message. I don't think this is a way to send a message.
Today, the conflict that may be used as an excuse for the slaughter in the States has continued unabated. Israeli armoured units mounted an incursion into a Palestinian-ruled town on the West Bank. At least 9 Palestinians were killed in the gun battle. Such raids by the Israelis used to provoke American condemnation, but not today. John Irvine, ITN, Jerusalem.
Earlier today at his embassy here in London, I spoke to the American ambassador William Farish. I began by asking him how such a horrific attack could have taken place.
It's very hard at this point, Trevor, because we're sitting over here in London and we're getting bits and pieces from Washington, but I think it's too soon to know, exactly how, other than the fact that, we know that these airplanes and probably a whole team of people that were well coordinated, including pilots, were enlisted to pull this incredible tragedy off.
President Bush, and it has been echoed here by Prime Minister Tony Blair, has talked about finding those responsible for this evil and making sure that they're brought to justice. Mr. Ambassador, that's easier said than done.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And I think that we have a lot of emotional reaction to something like this when it happens. I think that, obviously our country has total resolve to find who's done this and bring them to justice. I don't think there's any question in that, and the President's been very clear, and so is the Secretary of State on that.
Are you pleased, sir, about the response from the British government?
I couldn't be more pleased, mainly with Prime Minister Blair's reactions yesterday at the conference, the Foreign Minister, the Secretary of State. Everybody's reaction in the government has been outstanding as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Ambassador, what do acts such as these do to your country? Do they make America want to get continually involved in things like the crises in the Middle East, to which there must be solutions in other parts of the world? Or do they make people, they drive the nation into a greater kind of introspection, looking in on itself?
Of course, we've never had something like this happen. I don't think anybody has in modern peacetime. I don't think that this will cause our country to become isolationist. I think, on the other hand, it will make our country focus and our countrymen all over the world far more on the threat, worldwide threat of terror, as I mean, Pearl Harbor, taking us back to the last, anywhere near a similar situation to Americans. All of a sudden, the country rallied behind the president and behind the war effort.
To what extent does it shatter so many of the common assumptions about ordinary American life? Because Americans basically do not expect these types of things to happen on their territory.
We're a free society, and in a free society like ours and like yours, we don't expect these things to happen. But I think that, you know, as I say, I think our country will rally behind the president and will rise to the occasion.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. America's ambassador to Britain talking to me earlier today. Joining me now is Professor Gwyn, an expert on terrorism, especially in the Middle East. Professor Prins, can I begin with this? The intriguing reports tonight that the terrorists actually intended to hit either the White House or Air Force One. How credible can these be?
Well, we know a little bit more about this because just before we went on air, I was watching Ari Fleischer, the White House spokesman, addressing the press conference. And firstly, it appears that the aircraft which hit the Pentagon may well actually have had the White House as its target. But the question about Air Force One is intriguing and perplexing, as one of the journalists pointed out, because as he said to Mr. Fleischer, are you suggesting with the president on Air Force One in Florida...
He, by the way, is one of the presidential spokesmen.
That's right. Are you suggesting that one of these 4 planes was a threat? Because that doesn't look credible. Surely there must have been some other form of threat, which you haven't yet told us about, and the presidential spokesman didn't want to go any further into that. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this in due course.
Analyze for us, if you will, the language, the tone that President Bush, and for that matter Secretary of State Colin Powell, used today in describing how America will calibrate its response to these attacks.
Well, I think that 3 things are now beginning to come together. Firstly, we're moving from circumstantial evidence to much harder evidence. We know that because the following up of the phone taps that have led to the arrests in Florida and in Boston seem to be providing direct evidence of the bin Laden organization's involvement. Secondly, as you say, we have to rely very heavily on a close reading of what the president's been saying. And he's been, in the first speech, talking about the fact that there would be no distinction made between the perpetrators and those harboring them, and then both he and the Secretary of State speaking repeatedly about this being a state of war. And that links to the third thing, which I believe to be potentially momentous, which is the resolution of NATO to invoke Article 5.
Yes, Lord Robertson talked about it this evening.
That's right. Well, this is the core article of the NATO alliance, whereby an attack on one is an attack on all.
But it means that if the Americans should choose, say, to bomb parts of Afghanistan or Pakistan, and this is all speculation now, then we join in.
Then we go to war. That's what it means.
Yes, extraordinary consequences.
Well, I think we can be a little more nuanced about this, because when Lord Robertson was asked that question, he said, of course, invocation is distinct from the United States making an actual request, and at this stage we are still some distance from that.
Professor Prins, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
News in the aftermath of yesterday's attacks continue to reverberate at airports around the world. There's no sign of transatlantic flights resuming. Flights to Canada, to Pakistan, and many to Israel are still halted. Security at British airports has been tightened, and experts say we can all expect changes to the way we travel abroad, especially to America. Here's Chris Choi.
At first it was all unbelievable and far away. Today the aftershocks brought it all closer to home, into everyday life. Passengers at Heathrow tonight unable to fly because America's skies remain closed. London City Airport shut down after the capital declared its airspace an exclusion zone. As elsewhere, upgraded baggage security in Manchester. Overall, an estimated 25,000 travellers stranded.
We rent a car for 2 weeks, already paid. And we wanted to go to the Great Lakes in the USA.
Oh, well, it's a dreadful situation, and I realize it's nobody's fault here, so we don't blame anybody.
Now they told us that they booked us for a flight for Tuesday, it's about a week away, but hopefully maybe something will open up before then. They just don't know what's happening currently.
The travel disruption is rippling through airspace around the globe at the moment. What advice are you offering?
It is hard to predict whether the flights will get off the ground again over the next day or so. I'm hopeful we might have flights tomorrow, but I simply can't predict. As soon as they do get off the ground again, tour operators and airlines will be trying to get customers back who were due to travel over the last 2 or 3 days.
The biggest and most rapid security upgrade since the Gulf War has brought another tier of problems. Increased baggage and personal checks are slowing down the rate of flights to all destinations. Travel to Canada and Pakistan is affected by airspace exclusion zones. Tel Aviv is off the BA schedule. Only El Al is now being allowed to land in Israel.
Issue is, of course, that there are crew and there are aircraft all over the place, and there is obviously some congestion on the ground here, possibly some congestion in Europe. It is a big logistical operation to get people, aircraft in the right place at the right time to get the program flying again.
Yesterday